Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Reynolds. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. We would like to get started right away. It's about 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and there are a lot of people registered for today's session, and many of them are still coming in. But we're just going to take these first few minutes to go through some quick housekeeping items so that we can get right into the content and hopefully have plenty of time for questions. Just a brief disclaimer. This is something that our attorneys put together and require us to put in front of all of these sessions. And basically, in a nutshell, what this says is that we're going to be talking about a variety of topics around import-export compliance today. And although we do have expertise and a lot of background in these regulations, if for any reason something that we say does not compute or match what's in the regulations, just recognize that the regulations themselves and the government agencies who administer them are, of course, the governing authorities. I'd just like to welcome you all today. I know you're coming in from lots of places around the world, and we hope this is going to be a great session for you. Hopefully you all can hear me without any problems and can see these slides. If you can do one but not the other, you can certainly dial in using the conference number and access code provided here on the screen. If you're unable to see the slides, make sure that you go back and click the registration link, which should allow the GoToWebinar application to launch on your desktop. Sometimes there are firewall issues with different companies where GoToWebinar will not go through. But once that application launches, then you will be able to see these slides and hear our voices. We've gotten a lot of questions about being muted and unmuted. Just to let you know, everyone is going to be muted throughout this session because of the large number of people that we have on the call. So we will keep everyone muted. And then the best way to communicate with us is going to be through the chat or the Q&A toolbars on your GoToWebinar toolbar that you have. So feel free throughout the session to submit questions or let us know if you have any issues or technical difficulties. And then at the end of this presentation, we will have time for questions and we'll be addressing those. Okay, I'll try to address the first question that we get asked the most up front, which is, can we get a copy of these slides or can we get a recording of this webinar? The answer to both those questions is yes. It typically takes about a week for us to do that, but if you go to our website, exportsolutionsinc.com, and you go to the webinar section, by this time next week we should have a free copy of the slides for you to download, as well as a recording in Windows Media format that you can access for anybody who misses today's session or if you'd like to play it again. So check back in about a week and those should be on there. I know that some of you on the phone might be affiliated with the NEI and the Certified Export Specialist certification program that they have. Just to let you know that this course is approved for 1.5 CES credits. Now, in order to get those credits, we just need you to send us your name, your CES ID number, your company name, and you can email all that to the email address that you show here. I will say that some of you have sent us that information in advance, and if you have done that, we're going to ask that you send that to us again because we need to be able to prove that you are actually in attendance for this session before we submit your name. So just a quick reminder that if anybody has already sent us your information for CES credits, please go ahead and send that to us again. And as long as you're able to do that within about 48 hours, we will submit that to the NCBFAA, and you'll go ahead and get the credits for this course. Okay, we do offer a variety of webinars throughout the year, usually about 6 to 7 each year, every other month. And they're always free, so we welcome you to check back at our website. We should have next year's schedule up there pretty soon. But the next webinar that we do have is going to be on December 12th at 1 o'clock p.m. We always do them on the second Wednesday of every other month. And this one will be about kind of a recap or a year-end review that we do of all of the proposed changes and final rules and things that have gone on with ITAR and EAR throughout the year. So if you're interested in joining that session, you can sign up for free on our website, and again, check back there for future webinars as they become available. And if you have ideas for other webinars that you'd like, please, we're always looking for those topics that are interested to the export community out there, so let us know. I think I forgot to introduce myself. I apologize for that. My name is Tom Reynolds. I'm the Vice President of Export Solutions. And now I'm going to introduce the most important person of today's session, which is Marcy Gentry. Marcy is our Senior Consultant with Export Solutions. And I'll just give you some quick highlights and background before we get into today's topic, which is Schedule B and HTS codes. Marcy has more than 15 years of experience working in the trade compliance field. She has been involved in a variety of export compliance officer and executive positions at companies around the country, including some major companies like Dell Computer, Nortel Networks, and L3 and others. So she's very experienced when it comes to trade compliance and understanding the entire import-export compliance process. Marcy's been a licensed U.S. Customs broker since 2004, and she's also been an adjunct professor at the Austin Community College International Business Institute, teaching import supply chain courses and export compliance as well. So Marcy joins us today from Dallas, Texas, where I understand the weather is pretty hot, but I think the Dallas Cowboys are still reeling from their loss on Sunday, right?
Yes, they are. They are, as well as the Rangers.
But you're
a little bit rainy. It's supposed to get hot.
You're a New England Patriots fan anyway, so you probably don't care what the Cowboys are doing, right?
Exactly.
All right. Well, welcome, Marcy. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover today, for those of you, I know there's a variety of different folks on the phone, those that have lots of experience in the import and export compliance business and those that are pretty new to the area. So I'm going to try to cover this and hopefully both folks can learn whether you've been in it for a while or if you're just beginning in this area. But we'll first go through just an overview of what the Schedule B and the Harmonized tariff schedules are, what are they used for, what are they, and then what are the differences between those. So when do you use the HTS code versus the Schedule B, and why are there differences between the two? And then the main meat of the webinar today is going through the HTS, so learning how to actually assign an HTS code, what is the structure of the HTS. And the reason why I focus on the HTS is because the Schedule B and the HTS codes are very similar. The Schedule B was adopted from an export perspective, and we'll go through that in more detail, but they're very similar in the way that they are made up. You follow the same rules as you classify an item under the HTS code as you would the Schedule B. We'll also go into the rules of interpretation, which will really take a majority of the seminar today. The general rules of interpretation you can look at as really the commandments for assigning an HTS code or an import classification. And then we'll get into some useful tools. So once you've learned how to assign an HTS code, I'll show you some tools that are out there on the website that are either provided by the government or other entities that can help you identify your HTS code. And then at the very end, we'll take questions, and I know there's quite a few folks on here. I think we have over 200 individuals on this webinar. So we may not get to all of your questions. What we will try to do is if we don't get to your questions, we will send you an email back with the information or post them onto our website with a Q&A document. So the first piece here is the Schedule B, and for those of you who do exporting, you're probably very familiar with the Schedule B, but what the Schedule B is used for is the export. And what the U.S. government uses the HTS code and the Schedule B for is statistical purposes. And what they do is every time you're exporting an item out and you're required to fill out what they call an automated export system record, they use that information to gather trade statistics. So how much of one item is going to a certain country. They also use the HTS code on the import side, and we'll talk about that in a minute too, to see how much of a certain item is coming from which country. And that gathers the trade statistics. So you hear the trade deficit. This is where they're getting their numbers from, is from this documentation. And the Census Department is the one that is responsible for gathering these statistics. They also are the ones responsible for updating the Schedule B code. Customs is responsible for the HTS code, and I'll show you that in a minute, but Census is more on the Schedule B side of it. There are over 8,000 codes in the Schedule B, so anything that you can touch and feel is going to have some type of Schedule B or HTS code assigned to it. Really what the Schedule B is used for is when you're submitting your automated export system record, or for those of you that's been around for a while, the shipper's export declaration. That's used when you're exporting the products out. So not every export requires an automated export system. Usually they go by products that have over $2,500 per Schedule B number, or if you are shipping something that's on an export license or something that falls under the ITAR. Okay. The other thing I want to point out is that the Schedule B are revised annually on January 1st each year. So you do want to make sure that if you have something like a classification database and you're assigning Schedule Bs, to make sure that you go through the Schedule B when they are updated to ensure that your Schedule B is still valid. One way you'll find out that your Schedule B is not valid is when you submit it through the automated export system, it'll kick it back out. You can find the Schedule B number on the Census website, and here is just a picture of what their website looks like. There are a couple ways that you can look up the Schedule B. You can bring up a Schedule B and look it up just by the headings, and we'll go through what those are. Or they have another website that you can punch in. Let's say if you wanted to ship out a car, you would punch in the word car or type in the word car, and it would come back with different questions to get you to the point where they believe that Schedule B would be the correct Schedule B. But you got to make sure that you go back to the regulations and verify that. So it's just kind of a tool, and I'll show you that tool a little bit later on. So we talked about the Schedule B. The HTS code is used from the import side of the U.S. So anytime you're importing something into the U.S., you have to have an HTS code assigned to every product that's in your shipment. That HTS code also shows the tariff and duty assessments that are assigned to that product. So it'll show you how much duty is owed for that particular product. And that's how Customs collects their customs duties and tariffs on that. Back before they changed the regulations, I believe it was 96, but don't quote me on that, Customs used to be responsible for assigning HTS codes to products. That did change, and now they make the importer responsible. So if you are importing products, then you are responsible for assigning the correct classification to your products. You can get a copy of the HTS. Many companies will provide a paper copy. They will send you updates on a periodic basis as the regulations change. You can also get it online. The website that I showed you here, it's basically on Customs website. And I'm going to get out of this to show you. That's not the right one. No, it's not the right one. Bear with me, guys. So on the Customs website, they do have everything listed by chapters, and I always go to, because I don't like the big paper binders because they are huge. I think there's 2 big binders. They're about 5 inches thick. So if you don't have a lot of products that you're importing, you're not a distributor, you may just want to go online here to get the latest and just copy and print off your own chapters. So what are the main differences between the HTS and the Schedule B? Well, Census has said that you can use your HTS codes on the AES record. However, that's only if the HTS code matches the Schedule B. So there are some differences between the HTS and Schedule B. When we go through the headings and the subheadings, there's the last 2 digits or the last 4 digits are basically statistical notes, and those may be different. What Census has said is that they want to see the Schedule B numbers. So if your HTS and your Schedule B match, you certainly can use the HTS code, and we'll show you some examples as we go on how they can be different and some that are the same. But you may be responsible, if you do imports and exports, to have both the HTS and the Schedule B in your classification database are assigned to your products if they're different. There's about 200 codes that are different in the Schedule B than the HTS code. And then there are some chapters that you can't use from the HTS code for exports. And you'll see this notice that I have here at the bottom of the screen is really a notification to exporters that these products or these classifications cannot be used for Schedule Bs. And they're basically the Chapter 98 classifications. These are things that are temporary exports or repaired items coming back in. So they really just apply to the import piece of it, and they don't really give statistical information that Census wants to see. So that's why you don't use the Chapter 98. So let's go into the structure. The harmonized system structure is actually something that was developed by the World Customs Organization. So many countries follow the same structure. They have the same chapters, the same section notes. What's different may be the last 4 digits of the classification, and I'll show you that in a minute too. But the main structure from this is that you'll have sections, and you'll see up here the example I just put out is Section 1, which is live animals and animal products. The second section is vegetable products. And I'm going to go back to the website to show you there's a different section here, prepared foods. And so what you'll want to do is start with the section that applies to your products. So you can keep looking at the first few are mainly raw goods or animals, those types of products. You're starting in some of the other products like textiles and then metals and things like that, and then it goes into electronics, which is 84 and 85, and so forth and so on. Just keep in mind, Section 98 and 99 are usually not available for your export piece. So how is your harmonized, how is the HTS put together? So it's, in the U.S., it's 10 digits. Other countries, some will have 8, some will have 11, some can have 14. What's going to be the same for all countries is these first 6 digits. And what you'll see when you're classifying a product, the first 2 numbers of the HTS code is the 2-digit chapter. So if you're in Chapter 9, your first 2 digits are going to be 09. The first 4 digits is the heading. So you'll see when you go into the HTS book, this is an excerpt from the actual HTS, and you'll see the heading. This is this 4-digit number, the 0901, and then your 6-digit subheading is the 11, the dot 11. And then from there, it may be different for each of the countries. These are basically statistical purposes. And when you look at the U.S. regulations, they are specific to U.S. So if you're sending something to the EU, the last 4 digits could be different. They may only require 2 digits. They may have a 14-digit code. So you could have additional numbers that are after that. These last 4 digits are going to get you down to the nitty-gritty of what your product is. So the example we have here is organic coffee containing caffeine. So if you look down here, the first, you're going to go to Chapter 9, and then go to the subheading 0901, and you start looking for coffee, whether or not roasted or decaffeinated, and you'll look in here, and then you'll keep going down so you can fit yourself into the actual category. So we have the coffee that's certified organic, so you're going to fit into this statistical suffix of 15. On this particular product, you're going to have the rates of duty. So your general rates of duty are free. So if you're going to import this type of coffee, it's duty-free. So you pay no duty. That will be in your general column. The special right here is for countries that we may have free trade agreements with. So if there's something like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or GSP, there's the Singapore Free Trade Agreement, and the list goes on. If this product is part of one of those agreements, it would show you what the duty rate is here, which is generally free, but it's going to tell you what it qualifies for any of those special trade agreements. This particular product, probably because it's duty-free, doesn't qualify for any special trade agreements because it's already free coming in. The second column here is going to be from countries like North Korea, where we are not allowed to import, so North Korea and Cuba, where we're not allowed to import any items in. And then special circumstances, you can import items in. So let's say the coffee bean industry went under because there was droughts in majority of the coffee countries. They may be able to allow you to bring in North Korean or Cuban coffee, but it's very rare, and generally you have to get a license from customs to do that. The next piece here that I want to go into is the legal text of the harmonized system. So when you start looking at the regulations themselves, you want to make sure that you look at the sections, the chapters, the subheading notes, and we'll go through an example of each one of these are, but there are different text that's in there that will help you classify. So in section notes, that may tell you what's covered in that section, what's not covered in that section, and that type of information you can use for any legal basis or argument of how you classified a product. So if customs comes back and tells you that your product isn't classified right, or they come back and ask you for more information on how you classify the product, you can use the text in your sections and your chapters and your subheading notes as backup as to why you classified something. The other is the language and the general rules of interpretation. And so there you can use the arguments of what general rule that you use to classify a product to make those arguments as well. General rules of interpretation. So this is where we're going to focus most of our time on today, is the general rules of interpretation. You can look at this as kind of the 10 commandments of the laws of how you would classify a product. There are 6 general rules, and you have to follow those in order. So you've got to start with general rule 1 if you can't answer or figure out your classification from using general rule of interpretation 1. Then you go on to the next general rule. And so we're going to go through each one of those and spend some time on each one of those rules and give you some examples as to how you would apply each one of those rules. The general rules of interpretation, the foundation of these items, the main focus that you want to look at is that you've got to use the language that's in the 4-digit headings. So make sure that you're reading your 4-digit headings and picking out the one that's the most, that defines your product the most. So you may see a section that says coffee. You want to go to the heading that says coffee. You don't want to go to the one that says coffee beans. So you may want to look, you have to go through each one of those headings and keep reading through the headings until you find the one that fits your product and describes your product in more detail than the others. So an example of this is, and this is one that Customs uses a lot, is that an electric spin toothbrush could potentially be classified in the subheading 8509 as an electromechanical domestic appliance, or it can be with a self-contained motor, and it can be in heading 9603 as a brush. So the question here is whether or not you put that in a toothbrush or brush heading, or whether or not you put that into the electromechanical domestic appliance. And the reason for that is because it's a self-operating item that has its own motor. So which one clearly defines the item? And so what Customs has come back and said, and this comes from a ruling that's published out on Customs' website, is that that particular product is more of an appliance, the spin toothbrush, because of the motor. It defines it more as a motor and an appliance, domestic appliance. So the actual classification would go under heading 8509. What they did say, though, is because if you look at things like the Sonicare toothbrush, you replace the heads on those Sonicare toothbrushes. The head by itself, the brush head, would be under 9603 because the motor itself is not on that brush head. It's just really a brush, the replacement brushes. So that's where you got to be kind of careful to look at your products and see which heading fits your product in more detail. Going on to the first general rules of interpretation. The following are provided for ease of use and reference only. So there are things in the regulations. There's the table of contents, the alphabetical index, and then there's chapter and subchapter headings. What you need to do to determine your classification is really look at your headings, your section, and your chapter notes. Those are the key items, and if you're going to be taking the broker's exam, or if you've taken the broker's exam in the past, this is where they test you on. You always want to make sure you go back and read those section notes and the headings and the chapter notes, because they throw things out that you might think are in those particular chapters and heading notes. The first thing, too, is to understand that GR1, General Rules of Interpretation 1, is precedence over all of the other rules. So you first start here, look at your chapter notes, your section notes, and see if you can't find your item in there. So some of the easier things you might be able to find. There may be parts and components that are a little bit harder to find. Some of the electrical products or mechanical items may be harder to find. They may not be specifically identified in one of these chapter headings. The key thing I always tell you is make sure you read all the notes. And I'm going to keep going back to that, because if you don't, then you may miss something that can help you classify the item. There's specific things in those notes, whether it's the section notes, the chapter notes, or the heading notes, that provide definitions for products. They may describe things like metals, so what is a metal alloy. They may talk about different types of fabrics, what's a woven fabric versus what's a man-made fabric. So there's different things that you want to look at. And so you want to make sure that you look at those chapter notes and those chapter headings and section headings to make sure that you have proper classification. So the first example I have is a section note. So under Section 15, base metals and articles of base metals, it talks about the very first note of what is not covered in this section. So if you have a headgear that's made out of metal, you want to make sure that you don't look at this chapter anywhere in this chapter for this particular product. It goes someplace else. So make sure you look at these items. The other thing is, a good example here is jewelry. So if you have a stainless steel bracelet, it's not going to fall into the Section 15. You're going to want to look under the goods of Chapter 71. Okay. Another example here, here's an example of chapter notes. So the first one was section notes. So you have your section, and then you'll go into your chapter, and each chapter has their own notes. So you want to make sure you look at both the section notes and the chapter notes. The chapter notes themselves will talk about some things of how things are made up. So for this particular example, mixtures of products of headings 0904 and 0910 are to be classified as follows. So it talks about mixtures, and so it'll give you some areas of where you need to go and where your products may fall into. So it's when you start getting into more difficult items that aren't clearly called out, this is where you might want to go to find out more information as to where your product would be classified. The example of definition, so in the sections and chapter notes, so as you go through the regulations through the HTS code and you go through your headings, you might find things that say base metals. And so here's the example of what does customs mean by base metals, and so they list those out. So if your product is metal and it doesn't fall into one of these items, then it's not considered a base metal. So you want to make sure you go through, once again, looking at the definitions. This is how it will help you when you're doing your classification. Example 4, here's another example of Chapter 72, the iron and steel. So we looked at the section notes. Here's the chapter notes again, and it gives you basically, I would call it a formula or another definition of what pig iron is. So you may have iron, and then there's different types of iron, and this is what the definition would be for that particular item. And believe it or not, this comes into play when you're classifying things like screws and bolts. So there's not one HTS for screws. You actually have to look at what the screw may be made out of. So that's where it comes into an important play. The next rule is the General Rules of Interpretation, GR2. So if you can't clearly figure out where your product is, go to the next rule of interpretation. If you don't see your product identified clearly in one of the headings or the subheadings, and you can't figure it out from reading the section notes and chapter notes, then go on to the General Rule of Interpretation 2. There's two parts to General Rule Interpretation 2. And this really deals with incomplete or unfinished goods or unassembled or disassembled goods. I know a lot of folks may bring things into the United States that are unassembled, and then they may assemble them in the U.S. and then sell them, or they may just bring them in and send them to the store. So things like bicycles can come into a kit. I've seen barbecue grills and furniture. A lot of those things come into the United States unassembled, and they may sell those unassembled or assemble them in the U.S. for sale. The key thing is that you want to look at that product and see if your product fits into that category. The next part is general rules of interpretation 2, the mixtures and the combinations. So this really deals with mixtures of products. You have to look at what they call the essential character, and you'll see on part A from general rule interpretation, look for the essential character. What makes up that product? So Customs has provided a definition of what essential character is, and it varies from product to product. So you want to make sure that you look at it to see what is the essential character. So when you're looking at a bicycle assembly that's coming into the United States, you get your wheels, you get your bike frame, you've got your pedals, maybe the handlebars, and they're not all together. But really, what is the essential character of all of those components together? It's a bicycle. So when you're classifying something, you want to make sure you look at the essential character. One of the things that they say you can think about what the essential character is it can be looked at the nature or material of the component, the bulk, the quality, the weight, the value. So when you're looking at different things as to what costs the most out of the items, sometimes that can work, but it's a case-by-case basis. So you really have to look at what the product is that you're bringing in. What is it that you're selling? So you may be bringing in a computer. The computer itself may have a mouse, and it may have some other items that go with it, cables and some other, let's say, hard disks that may come with it. But what the essential thing is that's coming in is the computer. So you want to look at what the items that you're bringing in to see what is it that you're really trying to sell, what is the makeup, and in that case, you can look at the value of the items that are coming in. So going back to general rules of interpretation, the general rule tool of unfinished goods example, I already gave you the bike example. I pulled a ruling right from the Customs website. This is probably not the exact part or product, but very similar to what was in the ruling. And what the question was from the importer is they had earring danglers. So it was basically the earring without the post on the back that was coming in. Once the item came into the United States, they would put the post onto the dangle of the earring and sell it as an earring. So the question was, what would the classification be for that unfinished product? And it came back as it would be an earring. So, excuse me, guys. The main thing you want to look at is the essential character. So even though it's unassembled, it's the main focus of this is really an earring. So what else could it be used for? The way that it was set up, it couldn't really be used for a necklace or other areas. So you really look at the item that you're bringing in to see what is the essential character of that item. The other example I have here is unassembled goods. So I know a lot of folks bring in parts or kits, and so what you need to look at is that kit. Does everything make up a certain end item? And the example I have here is also from another ruling, and this was a closet kit that you can use for organization in your closet. And so what was packed in the box may be all these different things. So you have the shelf items, you may have the brackets, you have the screws and the bolts. They're all used to create this end item, which is the closet. The way that Customs came back and said this is that you look at it as household furniture. So you don't individually classify the bolts or the racks or the shelves. You can classify the whole thing as household goods under other furniture and parts, the 9403. So it was the end item that it was classified as. The next one here is General Rules of Interpretation, GRI 2B. So looking at mixtures and combinations. So when you think of a mixture, you can also look at chemicals, and then looking at chemicals, what is the main item. But here we have a couple of other examples of combinations. So you have an umbrella hat. So is it really a hat or is it an umbrella? The other example we have here is the candles that are inside a jar, like a mason jar. So do you classify it as a candle or do you classify it as a jar? Well, from the umbrella hat, what has come back is that the essential character is an umbrella. So you wouldn't necessarily wear the item as a hat for, like a hat that you would use for textile reasons to make yourself look good. Really, you're using the hat as an umbrella hat to shade you from the sun or from the rain. And that's the way that Customs looks at this particular item and classifies it as an umbrella. The candle or the jar. What you're looking at here is the essential characters, the candle, and the reason for that is that the jar itself is looked at mainly as a container, and the main product that you're selling here is the candle. You're not really selling the jar, and one of the arguments that you can use is whether or not the candle wax and the scent from the candle, how much that was in comparison to the jar. So you're looking at your essential character. And the ruling for this particular item is noted on here too, if you'd like to go look up the particulars on the Customs website. So if you can't determine the classification using GR1 or GR2, then you must go to GRI 3, so the General Rules of Interpretation 3. The General Rules of Interpretation 3, so for the product that can be classified in 2 or more areas, you classify it by the most specific detailed heading. So once again, look to see if you've got a heading that directly explains what the product is. 3B deals with mixed goods, composite goods, and goods put up and set for retail sale using essential characters. So you look at things like sets, usually like around Christmas time or around Father's Day. Home Depot will have a set, a tool set that you can buy for presents, and it may have a screwdriver, a hammer, and a wrench. And so each one of those is an essential character, and so you have to look at how would you classify those items. 3Cs is use the last heading in the numeric order. So if you look at that example of that tool set, you would actually look at each one of those. You'd assign a classification to each one of those, so the screwdriver, the hammer, and the wrench, and whichever one is last in the regulations is the heading that you use. Now the key for that is that you're going to make sure that it's sets for retail sales. So this isn't something that you would have separate boxes, you're just packed in separate boxes and you ship it out together. These items are packaged for retail sale, and that they are going to go out onto the shelf that way for a consumer to purchase. So you've got to be careful that you fit into that item as retail sale. The next thing that we'll go into is more detail onto each one of these GR3 topics. So the most specific heading. So when you look at an item, the example we have here is an unframed safety glass made of toughened or laminated glass that is shaped and identifiable for use in airplanes. So how would you classify that? There's a couple things that you could look at. Would you put it in safety glass under heading 7007 because it really looks like it's really a raw piece of glass, or would you put it in parts or aircraft and spacecraft parts under heading 8803 because it's been shaped for airplanes? What Customs has come back and said, and this is another ruling that they have put out there, is that safety glass falls into, in this particular case, 7007. So it is really more of safety glass. If you were to look at parts in 8803, and there's actually an informed compliance thing out there for aircraft, but for it to fall into the 8803, you really have to be able to say that it's an essential part of the aircraft. So is it a door for the aircraft? Is it a window that's already been preformed for that window and it has the outer edging of the window? Those types of things that fall into 8803. However, when you really got the raw piece of glass, and even though it's been shaped, it really still could be used for other purposes. So you've really got to look at the products and take that interpretation as to whether or not your product really is in the it can be identified in more of a topic like this, for example, safety glass. The general rules of interpretation B, so looking for more details. So for the purposes of this rule, the term goods put in sets for retail sale means goods that consist of at least 2 different articles that are in classifiable different headings. So that's, once again, is that example that we used with the hammer and the screwdriver and the wrench. So it has to be at least 2 different items. The products have to be put together to meet a particular need or carry out a specific activity. So in this case, they are tools that are used for hardware. The other area is that they're suitable for sale directly to users without repacking. So that would be like they're shrink wrapped together, and what you'll see on some of these things is that they're shrink wrapped together on the back of a cardboard box, or they're put together in a box that shouldn't be opened until the consumer opens it. So those are the types of things that you want to look at to meet this GRI 3. So here's an example of a kit that was sold. Another ruling is that a kit was put together with the paints, 6 small tubes of paint and a plastic palette for the paint, some brushes, and some art canvases. And it was packaged together and sold for retail sales. So how should this be classified? The examples that we have here is prepared painting canvases under heading 5901, paints heading 3213, paintbrushes heading 9603, and the palette heading 3926 or other articles of plastic. The ruling that came back on this is prepared painting canvases under 5901 because the essential character is imparted by the prepared artist canvases. So while this was put into retail set, the main character that they looked at for this is the essential character is the art canvas. So you've got to be careful when you're looking at these particular sets to look for that essential character. The rules of interpretation using the last heading. The example I have here is an item that is both a clock on one side and a picture frame on the other. So how should this be classified? Should it be classified as a clock, or should it be classified as a picture frame? And so what is the essential character of this particular product? Well, the way that customs look at it is looks at this particular item is that there really is no one essential character on this particular product. Each one of those items looks like it is a essential character. The picture frame is one and the clock is one. And because of when you look at value, the cost may be very similar for one side versus the other. This is actually a ruling that customs ruled on that the item actually goes under 9105 because it occurs last in the HTS. So Chapter 91 obviously comes after Chapter 90, so you would use Chapter 9105 and classify this particular product as a clock using that General Rule of Interpretation 3C. The next General Rule of Interpretation is GRI 4. So goods which cannot be classified using the GRIs 1 through 3 should be classified according to which they are most akin or most related to or alike. So you don't want to use this one that often. Customs doesn't like to see this rule used that much, but if there's nothing else that you can use in General Rules 1 through 3, then you want to use General 4. And so what you do is you look to see if the product is most like something else on the regulations. It depends on such factors as your descriptions, the character, purpose, or intended use of the product, the designation, production process, and the nature of the goods. So if you are looking at this, you want to be able to explain to customs why you think your product is most like the other one. So that can go into explaining how you produce the item, if it's the same end use of the item, it serves the same purpose. So they do the exact same thing. They may just look a little different. They may be made out of different materials, but the end use is the same. So you've just got to be able to explain that if customs comes back to challenge your classification. So the example that we have here is General Rules of Interpretation. Once again, this is another item that I pulled off of the cross or the customs ruling page. So this article is an oval tin with a plastic handle. So really, where would you classify that item? What came back as is that they classified it as a lunchbox. Now, I'll tell you, when I pulled this example up, it was listed out on the web. One is a lunchbox and one is a sewing kit container. So really, you have two different end uses. So what you got to look at is what can you look at when you look through the regulations. What is it most like? And so what customs used, they used GRI 4 and ruled it as 4202 and provided for trunk suitcases, vanity cases, attaché cases, briefcases, and similar containers. So it kind of fits into an overall category of containers. Okay. The next general rule of interpretation is the GRI 5. General Interpretation 5 has two sections. It has A and B. These two sections deal with various types of containers, with the articles. So as you bring in items, if they have a container or a case for that particular product, how do you classify the case? And so it goes through each one of those items. The first one deals with containers or cases that are specifically fitted to your end product. So they're also intended to be long-term uses. It can be cases and boxes, and we're not talking about things like your cardboard boxes that you use to ship. These would be hard cases and can be things like Pelican cases. And we'll have an example here as a guitar case. So they really talk a lot about things like instruments, violin cases, guitar cases. All of those are made specifically to fit the product. One of the things that you need to make sure that you look at is if the case is more than the actual product that it's shipping or that it's carrying. So one of the things I want to show you here is the difference between what is applicable to 5A and what is not. Under 5A, once again, the guitar case is fine, but under 5A, what is not okay would be this particular thing like a crystal candy dish that has candy. So you'll see things at Christmas time where they may have ornate liquor bottles, like a snowman liquor bottle made out of crystal that's also sold with the liquor, has liquor inside of it. So you have to look at what is more, what is costs more and what is the ideal thing that they're trying to sell. Sometimes these dishes are really the essential character and not the things that are inside. And in this particular case, the candy is not really what's being sold or is the article that's the essential character. It's really the dish or the carrying instrument there, this crystal dish. The General Rules of Interpretation 5B talks more about your packing containers and your material. And this is looking at things that you're not going to reuse. So this goes back to your cardboard boxes, your bubble wrap, the styrofoam, peanuts, or any of the other items that you use to prevent the items from getting damaged while they're in transit. The other thing is, does not apply to packing materials or packing containers clearly suitable for repetitive use. So once again, if it's for repetitive use, you're going to go back into GRI 5A. Okay. The General Rules of Interpretation, GRI 6. General Interpretation 6, it describes that for legal purposes, GRIs 1 to 5 govern classification at subheading levels within the same subheading. So what does that mean? Really what it's saying is that as you go through, you go 1 through 6 to find your chapter and your heading. Then you're going to go through the General Rules 1 through 5 to get to your subheading and then on to your statistical purposes. So example of that is the porcelain toilet here. I couldn't resist when I opened up the book and found the differences in the toilet here. What it's talking about is as you go through your product, let's say you've got this multi-piece porcelain toilet. So you've got the tank and you've got the actual bowl that you're shipping together, and it's coming into the U.S. So as you go through, you start with your GRI 1, 6910, and you're looking for if you can find something for the actual toilet. So ceramic sinks, wash basins, basins, wash basin pedestals. So you look and you find your item in 6910. Then you have to keep going through each one of the subheadings, 10 and then 90, to see if your item falls in here. So if your item is made of porcelain, then you're going to see, okay, it's called out, so I'm using GRI 1, and it falls into the porcelain area. Then you keep going through GRI 1 through 3 to see which one of your items fits in here. And we go down to it because it's a water closet bowls flushometer type. It's not just the bowl, we've also got the tank. Water closet bowls with tanks in one piece. Well, this is actually two pieces that's taken off here because they have a multiple piece porcelain toilet, so it wouldn't fall into the one piece. The second one would be flush tanks. Well, it's not just the flush tank, it's both the bowl and the flush tank. Then it talks about other water closet bowls. Well, it doesn't clearly fit in there. It's not a sink in laboratories, so it falls into the 50. Okay, so your classification would be 6910, 100050. So you want to keep going through the general rules of interpretation until you get down. Here's what I wanted to point out, the difference between the HTS and the Schedule B code. If you are an importer of these types of products and you're exporting it back out, you're going to have two different classifications. Your import classification is going to be the 0050, but the equivalent to that on the Schedule B is going to be the 0025. You'll see there are some differences in the statistical purposes. The reason for that, only census can really tell you. I guess they only care about whether or not you're sending out the complete toilet or not, but they have their reasons for it. The reasons, the differences in statistics can be duties on the import side. There may be manufacturers overseas that they're trying to prevent from coming into the U.S. to outrun the U.S. businesses, so they've upped the duty rates on certain types of products, or there may be quotas or tariffs or things like that that may be essential to that particular product, so that they have different suffixes on these particular products. On the outside, customs or census may care about certain items going out that customs doesn't care about. So that's why there's some differences in the last 4 digits on these products. In addition to the general rules of interpretation, there's just some rules that are U.S.-centric. So the general rules of interpretation are what can be used for any of the countries that are parties to the WCO, the World Customs Organization. There are some U.S.-specific rules as well. Except where specifically noted, the following rules apply. So end use is determined by use in the U.S. immediately prior to export. So when you're looking at Schedule Bs, and even from an HTS code perspective, these are things that you want to look at, is what is the use in the United States. When you're exporting out of the U.S., if you're importing into the U.S., what is the use before it's being exported out of the foreign country? Okay. Parts classification shall not prevail over specific provisions for such parts or accessories. So, for example, screws and batteries. You may have products that you ship component parts in there. So you might stick in some screws or some cables for a computer or some other kind of machinery or batteries. Those particular things do not prevail over the actual end product. So once again, look at the essential characters. So going back to those rules of interpretation, when you're shipping kits under GRI 2, what is the essential character of the entire product that's going out? Now, if you're shipping boxes of screws separately than the product itself, then you would put the screws separate and classify them separately. For classification of goods in which a textile material is named, follow the principles in Section 11, Note 2 regarding mixtures of 2 or more textile materials. So if you're involved in textile materials, clothing, and those types of items, you want to make sure that you follow those additional rules. We're not going to go into that because that could be a whole day of classification when you start talking about textiles. If you're not in the business of shipping textiles, I recommend that you don't import them in. There's lots of issues when you import textile products in, especially those marketing guys that like to do trade shows overseas and they have extra shirts that are coming in, or the marketing folks that want to buy shirts overseas because they're cheaper than buying here in the U.S. It's actually more of a hassle to bring those in, and I would suggest that they just do it domestically, because you get into some very unique details when you're importing textiles. If you still cannot decide what your product falls into, or you think it still can be into different things, you can always go to customs to get help. And so there's the customs rulings. If you are familiar with the export side and you deal with CCATs or classification requests, the custom rulings are the same thing. You have to provide a write-up to customs. You would give them an introduction level, provide information on the product. That could be things like specifications, data sheets, brochures, websites of the product that explains what the product is, the parameters of the product, what's it made up of, what the end use is, what your intended market is. But basically it needs to provide the product. Sometimes they may ask for a sample of the product. If the product's small enough, you can send it to customs with the ruling so they can take a look at it. If you start getting into areas where there's a big debate, you may even want to go in person to customs to do the presentation. But you can always do customs rulings. Customs doesn't charge anything to do the rulings, and you can use those rulings on further classifications. But you also have to be careful when you're doing those rulings, because if it comes back unfavorable, then you have to go back and change all of your entries and do the assessment on the entries. And you may have to pay duties and fees on top of that. Along with that ruling, you also have to give the rationale as to why you believe the HTS code falls, or why your product falls into the HTS code. So using the product information, you want to explain, why do you believe that this product falls into this category? You don't want to just send them in a ruling that says, here's my product, I have no idea what it's classified as, give me a classification, because you're not going to hear back from them. They really want you to explain what you think the HTS code is. They'll tell you if you're right or wrong, and then give their rationale back. I would suggest you always send it to customs headquarters and not your port director, because really the headquarters is what will make the ultimate decision if there is a issue with a particular port. So now I'm going to go into some of the helpful tools. There are things like the explanatory notes. The WCO is the World Customs Organization explanatory notes. These aren't free. You do have to purchase them, and I don't even know what the new price is on them, but I think they're anywhere from $200 to $400 depending on where you buy them. And what the explanatory notes are agreements between different countries as to what they believe a product's definitions are. So you come back to the explanatory notes, and it'll explain in detail certain items that wouldn't find headings. So you can think of
Hey, Marcy.
the heading note.
Marcy.
Mm-hmm.
This
Yes.
is Tom. We are getting a lot of breakup when you go off the slides and go out to other links on your computer. We're losing your audio, and a lot of people are reporting that. So I don't know if it's a bandwidth issue or not, but I'm not sure if there's a way to talk about that without maybe going to the internet, because it sounds like we're losing your audio when you do.
Okay, let's try this. Is that better?
Yeah, go ahead and give that a shot, and we'll see if I'll interrupt again if we start to lose you.
Okay. So under the explanatory note, it will give additional information or descriptions on individual HTS codes. So you won't see it go all the way out to the U.S. because this is actually an international document. But you can also use the explanatory notes to help you come up with a classification. What I do have to tell you is, though, the explanatory notes are not legal text. So they are helpful in making the decision, and customs will use them as a factor in deciding, but it's not something that you can use a legal basis to say, well, it's an explanatory note this way, that's why I classified it that. But you can use it as as an argument to the reason why you classified something the way that you did. The next thing is going to the census website. So there is a Schedule B search engine that Customs puts out. I showed you the first one, and hopefully I can get to this without breaking up again. They do have Another website that's pretty helpful, it is free to anybody that goes out there, but you can describe your product by putting in different information. So if you put in here, I'm just going to use the example of a window. It's going to come back and ask you more information. So if it's a window of an aircraft, you can click on aircraft. Then it's going to tell you whether it's framed or othered, and so you just keep going down and answering the question about a particular product. Eventually, it's going to come up to you with suggested classification. So you can't use this either as an argument, but it is a tool that they provide to you that can help you come up with it. And if you have no idea where to start, this is a good tool to use to help you start. And I see even with the HTS codes, because with the first 6 digits, and even most of the time the first 8 digits are the same for the HTS code and the Schedule B. So this is another good tool that you can use to help you find your classifications by just going through. Once again, you need to make sure you understand all about your products. You won't be able to classify your products unless you do have information on them. Another good tool is the HTS index. So this is another item that Customs has provided on their website. If you go to their website, all the way down, they do have their alphabetical index. The alphabetical index itself has products in the beginnings of the HTS code. So you can also look here to see if your product may be called out. You know, there's lots of products that aren't on here, but this may be another way for you to start looking for products.
Hey, Marcy.
If your items may fall.
Yeah, we're losing your audio again. It looks like when you're scrolling on web pages, for whatever reason, it cuts out your audio. So I just wanted to give you that,
okay.
that feedback.
I'll stay off of those. Okay. I'll stay off that. Another good tool is that there's lots of manufacturers and suppliers that put their HTS codes out there. So you may want to go back to your supplier. Some distributors will post their HTS codes out there. So you may want to just look at your manufacturer's suppliers. I also talk to people and say, hey, you may want to just ask your supplier how they classify their items. Now, that's not going to be an argument for you if Customs comes back and asks how you classified an item and why you classified it that way. You're responsible for still making sure that you assign the right classification. So verify what your suppliers have provided to you for particular component parts. The other good place to go to is the Customs ruling. That's the cross is the website, and so we have the website here, and I'd like to show you that, but I can't go into that from the bandwidth issue. Sorry about that. But if you go into rulings, and if you go onto their website, or you can click from the link when we provide the slides to you, you can go into the Customs website and type in certain things. So even if you're looking for things like just the GRIs, I just typed in GRI 1, GRI 2, and that would bring up different rulings. You can go in there and take a look at things like polarizers. And polarizers, if you're looking for a polarizer for a camera, it will bring up different rulings that have been done for polarizers. And so you can just kind of scroll through that, see if your products match that or similar to that. And if they are, you can certainly use another company's ruling, but you do have to make sure that your product is the same or very similar to that product, because really Customs will just use that ruling for that particular product that was reviewed, but you can always use that ruling as an argument as to why you classified something the way that you did. Okay. The example down here, I guess I did have a little excerpt from the index, so once again you can just take a look at the HTS index for your products. And so now I'm going to open it up to some questions. So we have about a half hour of questions. If there's, Tom, I'm going to let you see if there's any questions that are out there.
Thanks, Marcy, for that overview. Appreciate it. That was good. And apologize for any of the audio difficulties that folks experienced there. We do have a lot of questions, and a lot of them continue to come in, so we will try to get through as many of these as we can. First question is about understanding how to classify. So the issue is we struggle to understand when a part is classified as a part of the main item or classified as its own thing, or the whole item in and of itself. So can you talk a little bit about some of the criteria used to distinguish between those things?
Sure. So when you're looking at your main item, throughout the HTS and the Schedule B, there are sections in the HTS code. If you scroll down further into the headings and the subheadings, there are areas that are just for parts. If you do not see a section that's just for parts, then you need to start looking at the individual part themselves to see if it's called out. So if you're looking at things like a battery or a side panel, so if you've got a big piece of equipment, manufacturing equipment, and it's just a side panel that you're bringing in, if there is not a section for parts for that particular machinery, you may have to go to the section of steel if it's a steel part. It may fall under steel. So the first thing that you want to do is go through the headings and the subheadings and scroll down. It can be 2 or 3 subheadings down. It may not necessarily be in that same 4-digit heading. It may be in a different heading 4 or 5 down. So you got to keep going through because usually the parts fall after all of that first heading piece. Okay, Tom?
Great, thanks. Next question, is the HTS code the same as the HS codes we use in Europe?
They should be the same for the first 6 digits. So yes, I've seen the HTS codes called HS codes, HTC codes. I think some of the different ERP systems call them HTC, but they are the same. The first 6 digits are the same, or should be the same, and I say should, for all of the members of the WCO. That can change. I've seen it where some customs authorities in some countries have interpreted the regulations differently than those in the U.S. Each customs official has their own interpretation. So they may throw something into a different heading. So, but for the most part, the first 6 digits are supposed to be the same between the U.S. and the EU.
Thanks. Here's a question somewhat related to that. Should you only provide the first 6 digits of the foreign B on an export? Many countries have their own classification system, and we have been asked to convert for them and put their classification number on the customs invoice. I hesitate to do this as I don't want to classify the item incorrectly. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And so there is no rule stating that you have to put the foreign customs. It's really what you're going to do for your customer. And many of the companies I've worked for, we've put the Schedule B down, and we've said that it was a Schedule B code. For some of the customers, we would put the equivalent HTS code for the country where it's importing into. Do you have to do that? No. There are differences, and I'll tell you there are companies out there that can provide lists of what the equivalent to an HTS code is in another country. So they can provide a list of HTS codes, Schedule B code, and the related HTS is in other countries. So it's really up to you as to what you want to do with your customer. If it's a big customer and they're asking for that, you may want to go ahead and do that because it's the ease of the items getting through customs. We always printed the Schedule B numbers on the invoices because the invoices were printed by one person and the AES records were submitted by someone else. So if like a different person in the shipping department or the freight forwarders would input the AES records, and if that's the case, you may want to add your Schedule Bs to your commercial invoices just for the ease of getting it through the business so that the next person doesn't have to go look up the information.
Great, thanks. A couple questions about HTS versus Schedule B. One is a clarification. It says you mentioned that you can only use an HTS number when it is the same as Schedule B. Did we hear you correctly there? So can you comment on that?
Yes, in AES, the only thing that AES will take are Schedule Bs. Census has come back and said that. So if you input an HTS code that is not the same, that the Schedule B is not the same, you will get an error in AES if you don't input the Schedule B. So for the most part, what you want to do is take a look at your products. If you don't have a lot of products, what I recommend is just doing the HTS code. Certain things like integrated circuits, and there's some other items out there where the HTS codes are the exact same as the Schedule B. So you want to do a first initial review just to make sure they're the same, and as you go forward, just keep the HTS codes. But you want to take a look to make sure that they're the same, because AES will send you back an error. They now only accept the Schedule Bs.
Great, thank you. Another question. I was under the impression that as long as you did not have a select group of HTS numbers, that you can use either HTS or Schedule B as long as you use all the same. Is that true?
So that kind of goes back to the answer for the last question. If your HTS code is the same as your Schedule B, they're the same number, so you can use them in AES. But if your HTS code is different than your Schedule B, once again, you have to get the Schedule B number.
Great, thank you. If a company exports multiple electronic components overseas, should these be classified as a kit, or should each component be classified independently?
So the answer to that question is it depends. We'd have to look at what the components are. If the components, if they're assembled together and they make an end item, you can use the essential character of the item that they would be together. But you have to make sure that and do an analysis on your products to see, is the main essential character there. So if it's like a repair kit to an item, to an end item, then you may have to classify those individually. But going back to looking at that shelving unit, those are all piece parts, but when you put them all together, they make an end item. So you have to look at, when you look at component parts that you're sending out, are all of those component parts together make an end item? And if they don't, then you will probably have to use one of the other general rules of interpretation, or you may have to break them out. So once again, if they're not put together in retail sale, you may have to break those parts out and list them separately on your commercial invoice. It depends. So without knowing more information on it, I couldn't give you an exact answer, but hopefully that helps.
Great, thanks. Next question about GRIs. Would the GRI only be against imports, or should we also apply GRI rules against exports?
It should be used for both. So if you look at the Schedule B regulations, they're written almost exactly the same.
Great. Next question. Can you clarify the use of Chapter 98? You stated that you don't use that for export. We use it when exporting RMAs. I'm not sure what an RMA is. U.S. Census Bureau actually stated we could. Can you clarify? Did you mean to say that you can't use Chapter 98 for permanent imports?
No, you can't use Chapter 98 on your Schedule Bs. It even tells you in the HTS code that you can't. If Census told you that, well, let me step back here, because in Chapter 98, depending on which one you're using in Chapter 98, you still have to assign a regular item. So for those of you who are not familiar with Chapter 98, Chapter 98 is used for items that are being exported out and coming back in as repaired items. When you are using Chapter 98, you still have to assign your regular product classification in order to know which Chapter 98 heading and subheading and statistical notes that you're going to assign. If Customs said that, or if Census said that you can use the 9801 something something, I'd like to understand more about that, because everything that I've been told and what they've said to me and that's written in the regulations is that you're not allowed to use 98. And if you look at Chapter 98, the very first page on in the HTS code, it tells you that Chapter 98 should not be used for AES submissions.
Great. So if you want to follow up with us on that question, sounds like if we can get some more information from you, we might be able to give you some better advice on that issue. Okay, question about aircraft parts. Is there a difference between aluminum aircraft parts and titanium or stainless steel aircraft parts on Schedule B/HTS?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. So it depends on the part themselves. So if it's truly an aircraft part, there are no differences. Chapter 8803 is just aircraft parts. It doesn't matter what they're made out of. When we looked at the example of the plexiglass, what you have to look at is your part really considered an aircraft part? So I'll tell you, I worked for a company that did refurb for aircraft, and they tended to put everything in 8803, and that's just not the right place to put it. If you have wheels, the wheels are going to go into the wheel section. If you have windows for the aircraft that are made specifically for that aircraft, the glass is cut, it has the frame and everything else, you're going to go into that 8803 or Chapter 88. So you have to look at the part itself, the component parts, or the parts that you're looking at for the aircraft. Screws, nuts, bolts, those types of things are not considered aircraft parts. You really need to go back and look at, is that part specifically called out somewhere else in the regulations? So when you start looking at aircraft parts, it depends on what kind of part it is. Is it something that can be used on another item? And I shouldn't even say it, but if it's a bolt and it comes out and that bolt can only be used on the aircraft, it's still a bolt and you classify it as a bolt. But when you look at aircraft parts, and once again, I encourage you to go look at the section notes and the heading notes for aircraft, because it does talk a little bit more about what is an aircraft part and those headings and those subheadings. So it can depend on what the part is. But whether it's titanium or steel or some other type of metal, it depends on what that part is. Is it really an aircraft part, or should it be classified someplace else, because whatever the essential character is.
We have a lot of questions about can you classify this part or tell me what that part is. I think the purpose of this is to help give you some general guidelines to understand that, and we can certainly talk with folks one-off and get some more details to try to help you understand how something could be classified, but in many cases we're not able to gather enough information or details about the parts or the products that you're providing to us, I think, in this environment. So on a lot of those issues, if you've got a question on that, we'll try to follow up with you and get you some answers. Marcy, here's a question. This is on our favorite example of the porcelain tank, or let's call it the toilet. So I don't know if you want to go back to that slide, but it says on that porcelain tank example, why wouldn't we use the same Schedule B number that matched the HTS code ending in .50? I thought that we were supposed to use the same number if they match.
So one of the things you have to do is look to see if those particular examples are different. So what you see here is that it does call out for other water closet bowls and flush tanks, and because there is a different example on that, you do have to use the 0025.
So just to clarify, if there can be instances when they don't match and use the different numbers, is that correct?
That's correct. And so one of the things I always say is you want to verify that they do match on those. So if you're looking at an item, make sure that they do match, that the entire section, the headings and the subheadings match. And in this particular case, they do not match. So you want to make sure that they do match completely all the way through, because if they don't, then you will have to use the two differences.
Great, thanks. Let's see. Some questions about customs rulings. How long does it take for customs to come back with a formal ruling, and what should you do while you are waiting for that ruling? For example, you have an item that's waiting at a port for entry or export.
So, you know, I'll tell you again, that famous phrase, it depends. So customs rulings, depending on how busy they are and how complex the product is, I've seen them in a month, I've seen them take 6 months, I've seen them take a year on some of those rulings. So it depends on the product itself. What you can do is still use the classification that you believe it should be as you go through, continue to use the classification that you should use, or that you think that it should be classified as. But keep in mind, if Customs comes back with something else, you may have to pay additional duties, or in some cases you may receive a refund. But at that particular case, that's about all that you can do. The other thing you can do is call up Customs and talk to one of their agents to see what they feel the classification is, but sometimes they won't do it because they always want it in writing and send it up to headquarters. So it depends on how you approach it. But I would say continue to use it, but just realize that there may be a difference in the opinion, and that it may come back to where you have to pay for duties that are owed. And they take into consideration that you're getting a ruling, and then when you come back to do the classifications, or to come back and come back to Customs and redo all of the entries that you did before they were liquidated, you can use that as part of your mitigating factors that you were waiting for a Customs ruling. The other thing is not to import the item in until you get the classifications back. But I know business sometimes is not able to do that. So my suggestion is use the one that you think is the right one, and then be prepared to pay any duties and penalties if Customs comes back with a different ruling.
And then on those rulings, here's a second follow-up question. Can you dispute a formal ruling from Customs if you disagree with it?
Yes, you can dispute. I've seen that happen. I'll give you a case where I was at Dell, and they were bringing in the computer laptop bag. So back in the early 2000s, a lot of times they'd sell the laptops with the bags, and you have your carrying bags for those laptops. What Dell was bringing those bags in as a container that was specially made for the laptop. Well, Customs came back and said, no, we don't believe that those bags are considered containers or cases for the computer, because it has file folders and things to put pencils and pens and diskettes at that time in there. So it's not just a laptop container or case. And so there was a lot of disputes that came back to that, but really what happens is, yes, you can dispute it, but it ends up in court. So you've got to look at what is the cost to your business, think about what your lawyer fees will be, and the case can take years for it to settle. So yes, you can always come back and argue against the ruling, but you have to look at what is the cost to your company and what is it going to do to your company for future business. So if it's something that's big enough, you may want to go back and fight it. In this particular case, I think Dell lost the case. It is considered a brief case, so to speak, kind of with the example that we had before, with a duty rate of I think it was like 4.9% at that time, and it had quotas on it because it was leather coming in from China. So it depends. If that's a big part of your business, it may be something that you want to go back and fight against, but you really have to do an assessment too on your particular business as to whether or not it makes sense, and take it to your corporate counsel to see if you have a good argument to go back.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question on repairs. It says there's a specific Schedule B number for repairs. However, is there also an HTS number for repairs as well?
Yes, there is. That's with Chapter 98. And it depends on the product and what's happening, if it's under a warranty repair that you would go back into.
Okay. For kits, what we do, we have kits, and what we do when the exporter of record, I'm sorry, let me try that again. For a kit that we have, what do we do when the exporter of record will not list the bill of materials for a kit because the value is under the $2,500 limit?
When the exporter, so I would take it that the exporter is exporting from the U.S., and you're in a different country and you want your exporter to list the information. The other thing that you can do, I know at least in the U.S., is you can tell customs that you're going to provide them a different commercial invoice that lists out the products. You can also provide a list to the freight forwarder before it leaves the U.S. that will list those items out. A lot of times there should be a packing list as well. I would suggest that you go back to whoever's exporting the item out and tell them it's not based on the AES $2,500 requirement, that you're needing it from a customs perspective to import the goods, and that's a customary practice. I hear this a lot. It's like it's your supplier. I would get your procurement group in there to start talking to the supplier and mandate that they do it. Remember, you're the customer, so you can certainly put some requirements on your suppliers to do that. But there's some other things that you can do. Like I said, see if you can have them use the packing list or provide another commercial invoice. But each customs authority is different when you start talking about that documentation. The other thing is if you are importing to another country, sometimes the customs brokers have to translate the documents anyway into the local language, so they're redoing the documents into the local language. So you may have to have your customs broker redo the commercial invoices, or your freight forwarder redo the commercial invoices before they actually go through customs.
Okay, we have a few more minutes here, so I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then other questions we will try to address offline. This last question, or one of the last questions, is I'm a licensed broker with import background, and I'm now expanding into export. So with respect to classifying items for export, in other words, providing Schedule Bs, would it be easiest for me to classify as I would on the import side and then find the associated Schedule B to see if it's an exact match, as opposed to using the Schedule B search feature on the census site? Any thoughts on how to go about that?
Yeah, I would tell you start with the HTS codes because it's easier to get the customs ruling than it is from census. Generally, census will send back, because you can get rulings from census too, but they end up going to customs anyway. So it's better to start off with the HTS code. If you found it in the HTS code, and because you have all the tools with cross and the index and the explanatory notes, from the import perspective, I would assign the HTS code first and then go to the Schedule B. But if you're a company that doesn't do any importing, you may just want to start with the Schedule B. But there's some easier tools on the HTS side. And I'll tell you, when I classify Schedule Bs for some of the clients, I actually use Cross, which is the rulings website for customs, to start looking up things. But I also use the Schedule B code engine sometimes to start, just to give me an idea where to start sometimes too, to assign an HTS code. So you can use either one, but I would start with HTS codes because you can easily get the rulings there and then just apply it over to the Schedule Bs.
Great, thanks. And then last question, what happens to a shipment if customs finds an incorrect HTS classification?
So there's usually what they will start off with is a CF-28 or request for supplemental information. That's generally how it starts. And they will ask about a classification and that you provide supplemental information on your product. So they may say, send me in data brochures or technical data sheets and things like that. And that particular analyst will do, at that port, will make a decision. If you don't like their decision or they don't agree with you, that's when you can go to the rulings, or you can appeal it up to headquarters. But generally, you'll have to go in for a ruling to come back and to oversee what that classification person, analyst, did at that customs port. So, but that's generally how it starts. If they don't like your classification or if something's flagged, they'll send you a CF-28 request for information.
Great, thank you. All right, and then the most popular question of all, which is, will we get a copy of the slides and can we review a recording of the webinar? We've gotten a lot of that, and I'll just reiterate to everyone on the call, those will be posted on our website, typically within a week. If you go back to exportsolutionsinc.com and you look under the webinar tab, you will be able to download a copy of these slides as well as a recording of today's session. I know we had a lot of additional questions. We will work our best to try to follow up with each one of those, including some folks who asked for a follow-up phone call. We'll see if we have availability to do that. I would like to thank everybody for joining us on today's session, and thanks to Marcy for putting together this great presentation on Schedule B and HTS. I hope it was enjoyable for everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of the day today and a good week. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Take care.